Hi, this is Greg Salmieri, and this is our postscript session of the Atlas Project Live. I'm broadcasting this time from my house in Jersey City. Here's Ben Bayer, who's joining from his place in New Orleans. And this is, as we're calling it, a postscript session. The Atlas Project was a chapter-by-chapter weekly reading group on Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged. We finished the novel, I guess, last week and had a capstone, we called a capstone event in New York last weekend. And I just want to see how many people we have on here. Viewers, 11 viewers so far. It looks like 12. Okay, so people are starting to find us. A capstone event last weekend where we spent really 6 hours discussing different aspects of the novel with a group in Manhattan. And we basically we did 3 of what would be our normal size sessions. All right, well, let's get into it. One thing we wanted to talk about is things that people who have been following the project might do to continue their reading of Rand. They're thinking about Rand and this novel. If this has been a part of your life for the last 8 months, I guess it is, and you're going to miss having us on Tuesdays and miss the book. A few things. One of them is, well, for people who want to learn more about Atlas Shrugged, there's always the things that I'm always plugging. One of them being essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which, here we go, I have a copy of here on my shelf. Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, I think, is really the best book on Atlas Shrugged, one of the best books on Ayn Rand's ideas, and it's I think really fantastic. I'm in it. Ankar Gate is in it, who's guested with us a few times. Robert Mayu, who's appeared on the show once or twice, has edited it. A really fantastic book. So for people who want more on the novel, I recommend that. Of course, I recommend, as I have many times before, the companion to Ayn Rand, which Alan Godhelf and I edited as a kind of general reference work on Ayn Rand that has chapters by, again, a lot of the people who are in the Mayu book and who you've seen on the show, several chapters by me and by Alan Godhelf, Ankar Gate, Shoshana Milgram, Tora Buckman. It talks about sort of different aspects of Rand's thought. And then for people who want to study her philosophy as a philosophy, well, there are her own books of nonfiction essays, which certainly you should read. But in particular, an invaluable aid to thinking about Rand's philosophy as a whole and the systematicity of it is Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. Dr. Peikoff was Rand's, I think, best student by her account, and I think all of us who have studied with him. And he gave a lecture course that she endorsed as the only sort of presentation of her philosophy that she thought was fully accurate for the whole structure of it. And he produced a revised version of that in time, which is this book. And it's really, I think, a must-read for anyone who wants to study Objectivism as a philosophical system, which is
and Greg, I
the
should
thing you most want to do after reading a novel. Yeah, but if you do,
since you mentioned
it's the book.
Since you mentioned Dr. Peikoff, I should also mention, if you look in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see the logo for ARI Campus, which is the Institute's main online learning platform and is filled with any number of lectures by Objectivist scholars, including especially many important lectures by Dr. Peikoff on the philosophy of Objectivism. And this is stuff that you used to have to send away to get the tapes of for hundreds of dollars, and now it's there online for free. You've got to register, and when you do, an account is created. All of the old Atlas Project broadcasts, recordings of them, are now up there in this format, where you can track your progress through not only the lectures, but through sections of the lectures. So it's all parceled out for you, not just for the Atlas Project, but for all the main lecture series that are up there, including many of Dr. Peikoff's most important lectures on philosophy and history of philosophy, logic, etc. Maybe the logic one's not up there yet, but lots of stuff on many of the background lectures that form the basis for that book that you just mentioned are there as well.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a lot of fantastic material up there, especially Dr. Peikoff's material, but other courses as well, and other educational opportunities people should know about through the Ayn Rand Institute, Ben? I mean, of course, also there's Ayn Rand's other 3 novels, which you might read if you've enjoyed Atlas and haven't read them yet.
Yeah, well, one thing that people should be aware of is the upcoming Objectivist conference in Newport Beach, California. You can find out more about it at objectivistconferences.com or at ocon.aynrand.org. This is going to be in late June, early July. I think that the opportunity for student scholarships has probably mostly passed, though I'm not 100% certain of that. But certainly anybody who wants to come, for the normal tuition is able to do so. There is a discount, I think, if you're under 30. Both Greg and I are going to be presenting different things at this event. Now, this is both. Last year was the 60th anniversary of Atlas Shrugged. Next year, or this year, is the 75th anniversary of the Fountainhead, and so this is a Fountainhead themed conference in a number of regards. Greg, I think you're giving a talk on the Fountainhead, as are a number of other scholars. I'm giving I'm giving a few morning sessions on both the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. If you followed this project dutifully, I think nothing I discuss is going to be very new to you. But if you know people who are going who haven't been to the project, that they'll probably get something from it. I think I was saying that
material on the Fountainhead will be new to people, I think, Ben.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. We'll see. I haven't put it all together yet. There's been a number of people in the chat asking about whether we are going to do a Fountainhead project on the same scale as this one. And unfortunately, the answer to that question is no, for a variety of reasons. But the major one is that this was a lot of work, and we have other things we need to do. And it's the fact that the 2 anniversaries come next to each other it would be too much. But there may still be events being planned by the Institute for the 75th anniversary of the Fountainhead, which we may still be involved in. We're not sure yet what those are going to be. I don't know, Greg, did you want to say anything more about your Ocon session?
I'll just say Clarissa is saying that there's been an Atlas project in Spanish keeping pace with us, and it looks like a lot of the Atlas project in Spanish members want to go on and do a Fountainhead project. And if you guys want to read the Fountainhead in Spanish together, that's fantastic. You'll be ahead of us in the English-speaking world if you have that. I'd be happy to my audio up a little bit. I would be happy to if people are doing a Fountainhead group. It's not going to be through us doing it. It's not going to be through ARI. Betsy asked, can other Ayn Rand scholars do a Fountainhead project? Perhaps, but the Institute doesn't have one planned, so anyone who wants to do one is welcome to do it on their own. And if anyone is doing it, I would be very pleased to occasionally stop by or participate in some way, not, I think, on the scale that I've been doing this. It's but I'd be happy to be involved in that sometime. So if anyone is doing it and would like, to have me on as a guest or something, please let me know. But again, there's not an Institute project of anything on this scale. We might do some sessions or talks on it. And I am going to be talking about the Fountainhead at Ocon, as is Ankar Gate and Darrell Wright. So there are 4 lectures in Ocon's main section on the main, kind of plenary sessions, I guess you call it, on the first in the first week of Ocon, the first 4 days of Ocon, which is Ankar Gate doing 2 lectures on the Fountainhead, me doing 1, and Darrell Wright doing 1. And then there were a bunch of other lectures on the Fountainhead, at least 2 others that are part of OCON this year. Robert Mayhew is doing a lecture on humor in the Fountainhead, and I think Andy Bernstein is doing a lecture connected to the Fountainhead in some manner or other. I forget what his topic is. And then, of course, Ben and Aaron Smith are going to have a sort of, I guess, more classroom-like sessions that you guys are doing in the morning at OCON. And two of your sessions, Ben, are one of them. Ben's doing three of them, and I forget what you said, whether it's two or one of them is going to be on the Fountainhead and the other on Atlas Shrugged.
One on the Fountainhead, two on Atlas Shrugged.
Okay, so there'll be a fair amount of Atlas coverage or Fountainhead coverage at OCON this year. I hope all of you will come to OCON, and for those who can't be there in person, you can subscribe to live stream it, so you can join us. At least you can live stream the main sessions. I'm not sure about the breakout sessions, so you'll at least be able to live stream Ankar's two talks on the Fountainhead, mine and Daryl's, and I'm not sure about the others I mentioned, Ben's and Robert's and Andy's. But anyway, Clarissa, let me know if you guys go on to do anything in Spanish. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, should we also mention the last couple of things on the list to plug?
Sure.
So one is this new online publication that the Ayn Rand Institute has recently launched, which I am a participant, writer, doing a little bit of editing. It's called New Ideal. And it's intended as the Institute's sort of official online presence that all of our new intellectual content will be channeled through. And this will range from kind of commentary on Rand's philosophy in general to application of it to contemporary current affairs, controversial issues of the day. This project, the Atlas Project, is focused more on kind of Rand's timeless philosophy and literature. Every once in a while, we've discussed its application to current affairs, but the New Ideal Journal, the New Ideal online publication, is going to focus, I think, much more heavily on application to the world around us. And I should just mention something about the title of the journal, which I think is a good one, because it's emphasizing. I mean, we talked a lot in the Atlas Project about Ayn Rand's view about idealism, and in fact, it was the sort of theme of the little promo video that we released, and the title is reflecting on the same issue, which is that, for the longest time, people have thought idealism is one thing, practicality is another. They're in opposition to each other. If you want to be practical, you can't be idealistic. But as we've now explored in some detail in discussing this novel, that's, Rand's view is that this is a product of the particular kind of ideal that people accept. And, which, when you get to Galt's speech, it reveals this morality of death. And if you hold that as your ideal, then yeah, you're going to find that rather impractical and inapplicable to the controversies of the day. But if instead you embrace a new ideal, this is not so much of a quandary.
Yeah. And it's, yes, so a new approach to idealism and a new content to those ideals. Anyway, I've read the first few pieces on there, and I've really enjoyed them, and found particularly Ankar Gate's piece on the benevolent universe premise and justice, I thought was really excellent. Ben?
I've got a couple of, my very first post, which I haven't done much to promote, is actually about the Atlas Project. I took a few excerpts from past broadcasts just to illustrate how this kind of the range of issues that we've covered in this project, that it's a project that deals with matters much deeper than politics. I took a few exchanges that Greg and I had from a variety of different broadcasts on a variety of different interesting topics, from ethics and politics. Well, not so much politics, ethics and culture and aesthetics even, which you can explore. I've got a couple of pieces that will be forthcoming. One on an issue that came up in one of the last Atlas Project Capstone lectures, which is the abortion controversy. I'll probably be doing a series on those. another one on free will, and then some others planned in the future on ethics and on conspiracy theories, which I think should be interesting.
That is interesting.
And then the last big thing on our list that we wanted to definitely not forget to mention is the essay contest, because that's a big part of the reason that we've been doing this whole project, is to promote the Institute's Atlas Shrugged essay contest. The deadline for that is quickly approaching. I think it's just now weeks away. Let me actually get the specific details this time so that I can tell you a little bit more about it. But let's see here. We've got Atlas Shrugged, and this is available if you go to the Ayn Rand Institute's website under the students section, or you can just Google Atlas Shrugged essay contest. But the deadline is May 15th. First place is $10,000. Second place is $2,000. Third place, $1,000. And then there's $100 and $50 prizes for finalists and semifinalists. This is for 12th graders, college undergraduates, and graduate students. And here's just a little sample of the topics that the essay contest is asking people to write about. One is about the Phoenix Durango destruction and what factors make it possible, and how this relates to the meaning and theme of the novel, and how it relates to one of her nonfiction essays. A second is about capitalism's more conventional defenders who use the public good as a justification for capitalism. We've spent some time talking about the notion of the public interest and the role that it plays as a kind of rationalization in this novel. I might even bring up a little bit more about that later tonight. And then last of all, a topic about check your premises and the contradictions that the heroes of the novel encounter, and their attempts to check their premises to eliminate these contradictions. Mm-hmm. So check that out if you are a student, falls into that category, into one of those categories, and are interested possibly in winning some money. You can go back and look at older recordings of the Atlas Project to polish up your understanding of some of these topics. And one thing I think you forgot to mention, Greg, is that while all of the recordings from this broadcast are linked to in ARI Campus, you can also get a more comprehensive list of links to all the different recordings in all their different forms if you go to the Atlas Project Facebook group, where there are some Facebook pages that we've assembled, one for each of the three parts of the novels with comprehensive lists of links. And I've actually added those to Facebook's new announcement section at the top of the Facebook group. It used to be we could only pin one post for the majority of this project. Then at the very end, they gave us what we wish we had all along, which was the ability to basically pin multiple posts. And now I've included in and it's called the announcement section. If you click this kind of little caret or wedge button, it'll show all the posts that are pinned as announcements. I've got the 3 pages for each of the parts pinned. I've also got the Capstone broadcasts pinned. So you can check out those comprehensive link lists there.
Good, that's useful. And of course, everyone probably knows already, but there's a playlist for this on YouTube. Atlas Project is available as a podcast via iTunes and Stitcher, I think, and SoundCloud maybe. So there are a bunch of ways to get all the audio for people who want to re-listen, or who are haven't heard the whole thing but want to listen to it. Okay, so the main thing we wanted to talk about today is wanted to spend some time on reflecting on what we each learned from the Atlas Project. We wanted to drill a little deeper into a couple of questions that came up in the Capstone sessions, or that you guys raised since. And let's start with by talking a bit about what we learned. And we each have a few points to make. Ben, do you want to start out with some of the things you learned during this? Or that struck you this time through?
Well, so I was thinking that I was going to go second, and one of the first things I was going to say was, well, I learned all of the things that Greg learned too. because Greg learned a lot and then did a good job communicating them to the rest of us, but we'll have to wait for that in a minute. So I'll just mention some of the things I think I learned on my own. And
I
then
thought we'd stagger them rather than do it in the order we had here. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay. Well, so one thing I thought was interesting, I've acquired more of an interest lately in literature, generally speaking. And so I've been on the lookout for the particularly literary aspects of this book. And so a couple of things that struck me in that regard this reading around, and I've lost track of how many times I've read the book now, so I don't know if this is the 8th or the 9th time, but this time around I was especially interested to notice a lot of her use of sort of recurring imagery and metaphors. And I mean, there's some obvious ones that everybody knows about, the mythological images and so forth. But I was struck this time, and if you go back through the various episodes, you'll see me sometimes commenting on these. Some of them are ones that Greg pointed out, but then I noticed others of my own. So like the cotton and the fog imagery that's extended throughout the novel to denote evasion or drift in one's thinking, or people who don't believe in a fixed identity. There's the blood and the rust and the dust, which we talked about a little bit more toward the end of the novel when we were looking at Reardon's rescue of the wet nurse from the factory. And then there's others where it's not extended throughout the whole novel, but confined to particular sequences, and you can see her doing things with them in the sequence. So one example that I saw was for the first time was there's a scene with Ferris and Reardon where Ferris is trying to blackmail Reardon, and he's initially described as a card sharp, and you see then different analogies or metaphors about card playing extended throughout the scene. In the same scene, we get that he's, made his name as a kind of animal experimenter, and we see him thinking about Reardon as an animal who he's experimenting on, though Reardon then turns that around on him. Lots of interesting death imagery that I saw going throughout the Starnesville scene. There's the machine imagery that I saw both in connection with Stadler's trip to the Project X exhibit, and also Reardon's contemplating Mouch's role in the evil in the world, which ultimately all connects up to Rand's view about the impotence of evil. And of course, the tumblers or tumbrils, depending on which edition you look at, sequence, which I've noticed many times before, but I'm now seeing as a yet another example of the way that she will pick this imagery and use it throughout a sequence to illustrate some kind of development the character is going through. There were others. There were other recurring metaphors, not so much imagery, but metaphors that I saw in other scenes, which I won't go into the details of them here, but I'll just point out that this is something that is interesting to look for when you are approaching this from a more literary perspective. Greg, I had a couple of other categories of things, but it sounded like you wanted to stagger. So did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I thought it would be more interesting to stagger a bit. Laura, is Laura with us now? Can we see? She was urging us to talk more about Ayn Rand's literary style. So we're doing that a bit through the points you're raising now, Ben. Maybe we'll have a little bit more to say on it later. But Laura, if you're here, chime in with some more specific questions or thoughts about her literary style, and we'll, if we're not saying enough for your taste about it. So one of the things, there are a few things that I focused on this time differently than previous times. I focused a lot more on the minor characters than I have on a previous read through the book, thinking just, what's distinctive about Mouch as opposed to Thompson, as opposed to Weatherby, as opposed to these minor looters and also minor positive characters. And also Eddie, who's not a minor character, but who isn't in the same kind of starring role that Dagny is. So I focused more on these people this time and thinking about details of their character. One is I was thinking a lot more about Eddie, and from the beginning there was a lot of discussion of him on the spoilers page, and that I was following along in that and participating a bit. And the issue of is it right to say that Eddie's just as good as or just as virtuous as the heroes, but not as smart, or is there some not as capable, or is there some other way to understand what he's doing? Is he morally worse than the heroes? I mean, Robert, who was with us in New York, and a number of other people are frustrated with Eddie, think he's of lesser character than the heroes. And sort of what to say about that is something I've been thinking a lot more about. And my current view is it's I don't think it's wrong to say that he's as moral as the heroes proper, but less able. But I think it's, I mean, that's in any case what the author said, right? But I think it's there's a way to hear that that's simpler than the facts of the case actually are. I mean, part of what the mind gives you is a kind of having a powerful mind gives you is a kind of potentiality for a spiritual capacity that we see in Dagny and Reardon and in Galt and Francisco, but not in Eddie. Eddie is dependent not just in figuring out how to solve problems, but in figuring out what problems to solve, in setting goals for himself. And in this sense, he sort of has less spiritual grandeur than the other characters. And I think this is largely due to his lesser ability than the other characters. But it's a characterological fact about him, not just a he do worse on some kind of academic test or problem solving test or something. So I think if one kind of factors that in, it makes more sense of understanding Eddie. Ben, it seemed like you had some disagreements on this or some points you wanted to raise.
Well, I'm still not sure if I get your point. What is this extra spiritual quality that you think he has, and how does this, or that he doesn't have? What is the extra spiritual quality that he doesn't have, and how does this affect evaluation of the idea that he's morally good but lacking in ability? Is that a false statement?
One way to put it is, what does it mean to be morally good or morally as good as someone? At the deepest and most fundamental level for Rand, it's, are you choosing to think? Are you exercising your reason to the best of your ability? And on that count, yes, he is. So if we're restricting what we mean by his being rational to just that absolutely core fundamental thing, then Eddie is rational and is as good as anyone, as good as Galt. But that core sense of morality doesn't make sense of some of the other kind of moral language we find even in the novel, right? Of Reardon's the guiltiest man in the room at the party, even though Reardon's trying his best, right? And Dagny's guilty of certain things. And there's a kind of extended sense of morality where it means not just are you being as rational as possible, but also have you recognized and are you consistently grasping and implementing certain facts and doing it correctly? And even the other heroes who aren't on strike yet, the scabs, aren't doing that. And so in that sense, they're less moral than Galt, though in the fundamental
right, but then
sense,
that's what makes
not.
me wonder what this tells us about Eddie in particular, given that this is something that he seems to share with them.
And then there's a third thing, which is the thing that I think people who are down on Eddie about, which is that he seems a bit kind of reactive rather than proactive in his choice of values and life course, in his setting a direction for himself, in what kind of possibilities he envisions and chooses his values from. So for him, right, there's this thing, Taggart Transcontinental, from ocean to ocean forever, that's around him, and that some of the people he admires around him, like Dagny, view as great, and that he sees as exciting, and he just kind of latches himself onto that. And he's scared by things that are too new and different. He likes Francisco because he scares him, but he scares him rather than, he makes him feel safe rather. Whereas he frightens Dagny, and that's what she likes about him. There's a kind of smallness of and tentativeness and feebleness to Eddie that's opposite to Dagny. That's, I think, what people who were down on Eddie were didn't like about him, and I think that is itself a character trait, but it's a character trait that comes from being someone who isn't as able to meet the challenges of life as the people he's being compared to. And I should add that I think, Ben, you want to break in here though before I add that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so that the last thing you just said was what I was about to comment on, which is that I don't see why the reactive aspect of him couldn't be simply assimilated to the issue of ability. That's exactly what you would expect of somebody of lesser ability, that they would have to be reactive to the ones of greater ability. And isn't that in part the lesson of the Pyramid of Ability section in Galt's speech? Now, I do think there's another issue in there that's also related to the ability issue, and that's an issue connected to self-esteem, which is something that I wanted to comment on in the list of things that I learned something about. So I don't know if you wanted to wrap your point up before I moved on to that.
Say one more thing about Eddie, and let's move on to self-esteem, which is so the point I wanted to make about this is a way in which your ability and understanding of your own ability is something that partially shapes your character. And so it's not just that Eddie acts just the same as Dagny, but fails to accomplish some things he sets his mind to that she would accomplish. It's that his way of living in the world and facing the world is different because of it. But the other thing I wanted to say is it's very easy to, or not very, I think a lot of people read this novel and see themselves as Dagny or as Reardon or something, and then are all down on Eddie, right? Eddie does a lot of good things. Most, you guy who just read the book, you didn't make some new metal, and neither have I. That's revolutionizing the industry. And how many of us, what we do in our career is we've come up with a whole new way to change the world. I mean, there are people like that, and they're really admirable, and maybe some of them are among you who are watching and you who are reading. And hopefully we all have some of that in us, or should try to foster that spirit in ourselves. But, to find a really cool company and a really exciting person that you love working with when you're young and follow that career path, that's not pathetic or lame. That's, pretty good.
Yeah, so let me say a few things then about the self-esteem issue that I've noticed. And that is, I was really struck this time through how much there is on this topic throughout the whole book. And this is maybe falling under a wider heading of generally how much of this content of Galt's speech, I think, you can find either reflected or reflected in earlier events before the speech or foreshadowing events later in the speech. And I mean, I did a more intensive study of Galt's speech for this than I've ever done before, and I made a rather elaborate outline and actively looked for events in the novel that would illustrate various points. And the self-esteem issue in particular, I saw so much connected to it, and particularly, and then we talked about this a little bit in a previous episode, the point that she makes, or that she has Galt make, that people have no choice about the need for self-esteem. Their only choice is about the standard, the standard of self-esteem that they're going to act upon. And then, of course, she talks about how some people use morality of death as their standard of self-esteem, and that's self-undercutting. Incidentally, she uses almost exactly parallel language in her essay, Philosophy Who Needs It, to describe the need for philosophy, how people don't have a choice about the need for philosophy. Their only choice is about whether they will integrate their philosophy or not. And I think that these are actually closely related issues, because, of course, the extent to which one attempts to integrate one's philosophy into a rational whole is one of the things that's going to determine whether or not one has self-esteem. And I think she even makes that clear in the same passage in Philosophy Who Needs It. But going back to the novel, there's just so much that you can understand about the way characters behave when you think that they too need self-esteem. And this applies not just to the heroes, but to the villains, and almost especially to the villains, because you see so much of the dialogue that the villains engage in with each other and with the heroes. You can understand in terms of that need. There's all these rationalizations that are used for the decisions, for example, that Jim makes, where he invokes the public interest or brother love or whatever, and why is he doing this? Well, it's because he needs to convince himself, not just others, but himself, that he's doing the right thing, because he needs to know that he's worthy of living, because he needs self-esteem. And sometimes when he then realizes that he did a bad thing, it's instead of trying to justify his actions, he tries to exculpate his actions. And Jim is notorious for throughout the novel talking about, I couldn't help it. And lots of other of the villains are finding ways to exempt themselves from responsibility in one way or another. And you can also understand that as a manifestation of the need for self-esteem. And of course, we've spent a lot of time talking about the role of evasion in this novel, as one of the ways in which people choose not to think. And Francisco said the only sin is to choose not to think. And then Galt, of course, elaborates on this idea, showing that the choice to think or not to think is the basic locus of free will. And you get a much better understanding of the role of evasion, particularly for the sake of preserving self-esteem, because what a lot of these rationalizations do is to cover up what the person's actual motive is. And we've now discussed how one of the main motive of the villains in the novel is destruction, and that they don't want to live, and sometimes they actively want to die, but they don't want to realize that they want that. And so they engage in these various rationalizations to evade that fact so as to preserve their self-esteem, because they need self-esteem. No one can survive, pronouncing themselves evil. And we see at the end what happens to James when he realizes that he is, and he can no longer evade it. And it's the kind of ultimate loss of self-esteem in that particular scene. But you see other versions of this as well. And I think this connects back to the discussion of Eddie, but especially to Cheryl. I think that part of what's happening with both of those characters, unlike James, who realizes that he isn't worthy of living, they, for one reason or another, through one mistake or another, I think in both of their cases, they're honest mistakes, they form the conviction that they're not able to live. Certainly Cheryl thinks she's not able to live in this world. She thinks she's worthy, but she's not able. And that's why she decides to commit suicide. That's the clear case. Now, Eddie's, I think, a little bit more controversial. But I think that, he's lost a lot of the things that he valued. He's lost Dagny romantically, and now, the railroad's falling apart. I mean, especially given what he knows about his just purely intellectual abilities, that's got to have some kind of impact on a kind of metaphysical attitude toward his ability to live in the world. And that's part of the reason that I've emphasized what I think is the importance of that exchange that he has with Dagny toward the end, where he says, with everything I've seen, I can't quit. And, you can debate about what the choice to go to California means. Is it a last ditch effort to save Taggart Transcontinental because he really thinks he can do it? Or is it something more like a metaphorical going down with the ship? I mean, certainly going down with the ship is actually mentioned in that final scene with him. Whether that should be thought of as a suicide or not is a more debatable issue. But I think Greg, you were saying that there's some spiritual quality that Eddie's lacking. And, without denigrating his morality, I think you can understand a fair amount of that in terms of a undercut self-esteem, but not one that's been undercut because of any, immoral choices of his, but simply because his own understanding of his own abilities in this kind of world have that effect. I had another point, but let's leave it on that.
While we're on the topic of Eddie, two further things, because Paul's asking a question about him. And also, there's an issue of what's going on with him and Dagny. I mean, I don't think he ever thought he had a chance romantically with Dagny, or was holding out hope for that. And then his hopes were dashed when he found out about the thing with Reardon. I don't think he ever pictured himself with her or thought he would be with her. I think, nevertheless, his discovery that he was in love with her, and that was the nature of his devotion to her, or part of his devotion to her, I do think is really revealing to him. And his discovery that sort of she has other people in her life. She has, he had this kind of notion of it's her and me against the world, each of us, these people who have nothing, so to speak, other than the railroad. And his realization that wasn't her view of it and her life, in a context where he didn't see how he could go on to have anything else in his life, I think hurt him. But it's not as though, he was picturing them getting together and, oh no, Reardon's got her,
right.
Now called. It's not that he lost her. It's something about his vision of her changed, or his vision of what they were together. As for Paul asks, why would Rand choose the message she did of his demise? And I get from her perspective, she didn't show him dying. I mean, what's the gerundive form of demise? She didn't show him dying. She showed him in this kind of quandary where we don't know what's going to happen next. It's certainly not looking too good for him. But why doesn't he go with the wagon train? Well, he doesn't. Part of it is that he can't bear to give up the comet. But part of it is also that he doesn't have any confidence in this wagon train. He doesn't think it's headed to some good end. Right? So it's not as though he thinks the wagon train, they're just going to die out. So they don't have any more destination than he does from his perspective. We don't know what's going to happen to him. Other people will come by in time, next week or next month maybe. Presumably there's some provisions left on the train, so he's not starving. Although Jim did cancel food car service sometime back. And he's not going to be able to get the train running, but hopefully someone else will come. And I think it's deliberately left ambiguous who will come and what will happen. I expect that he dies out there, but I think it's purposely left vague. And I think that's at least how I understand the literary significance. Will says perhaps Dan Conway finds him next. That would be a good turn of events. He could take him out fishing, and Dan will have heard Galt's speech, so maybe he'll be will have come back from the dead, or be ready to come back from the dead at this point. Okay, so let's look at some of our other points. The other thing that I really focused on or noticed this time through connects to the novel being on a fantasy premise. I had known about that. I had not thought this strike was possible or that Rand thought it was possible before. And I've always considered that aspect of the novel a fantasy premise. And I'd also have always thought that it's not primarily a political novel, that politics takes a back seat to it, to ethics in the novel, and to metaphysics. But what I've noticed more this time through is how connected those things are. You couldn't have a novel with this fantasy premise, the theme of which was one could refound a society on the basis of philosophy of egoism and capitalism. But if you had a novel that was about society and refounding society and founding it on an egoistic basis and so forth, if you had a novel that was really about social change, and the message of it was about how to achieve social change and how to affect a political change, right? Then the fact that its central conceit is a fantasy premise, something that couldn't really happen, would undo it. You wouldn't be able to make a novel work like that. And I think that that's why there's actually so little in the novel about what rebuilding the world is going to look like. It's not a novel about how to take down and rebuild the world. It's a novel about a man who did take down and rebuild the world in a way that you couldn't really do. But what is real about it is the stuff about individual motivation and the nature of human beings, and the very deep stuff about how that relates to how people should and could live together in a society. It's not realistic at the level of detail that would be needed to have a, so that you could formulate the same plan for social change or revolution that they did, except at the most abstract level by endorsing a new ethics and by refusing to sanction the old ethics. And I think that's what the novel's about. What it has to say about social change is it depends on a change of ideas. And it talks about how to embrace those new ideas in oneself, and maybe somewhat about how to communicate them. But the fantasy premise prevents it from being more concretely political, because it's the concretely political elements about it that are fantastic. That is, that you can cause a society to alter in this time period by this kind of a method. So that's a connection I hadn't made before. I know, Ben, you had some thoughts about some things you wanted to discuss about the fantastic character of the novel. This came up a little bit between you and Ankar during the Capstone session.
Right. Well, this wasn't so much anything that I learned from this reading, but since it connects to this point of yours, we might as well discuss it. That I had suggested that fantasy element was characteristic of a lot of romantic fiction, and Ankar pushed back on that by suggesting that, romantic fiction characteristically features unusual starting points, and the examples that I had cited from Victor Hugo, he would characterize as unusual, as you put it, Greg, removed from journalistic reality, but still possible. And I mean, I think that's a fair point, that there's definitely a difference between a kind of fantastic what-if premise and a simply unusual premise. Though I should mention that at the same time, there is still, I think, characteristically romantic fiction that sometimes features something more like the fantastic than simply the unusual. And you see this even in Hugo, like The Man Who Laughs, for instance, which is, about Gwynplaine, who's been a victim of the Comprachicos, who are people who perform surgery on the face of children so that they can sell them off as freaks to provide entertainment in royal salons and freak shows and circuses. It's not just fictional. I would say probably not even possible to do that, at least given the medical technology in the 16th century, whenever that was set. And depending on how you define romanticism, certainly Frankenstein, Wuthering Heights had huge elements of sci-fi or fantasy. Now, that's depending on how you define romanticism. And Greg, I thought it maybe would be useful for us to discuss briefly what Rand's actual understanding of that concept was. You want to say something about that, and we can go back and forth a bit?
Well, she defined it as the school of literature based on the premise that human beings have free will, man has free will. But I think when we're talking about a definition like this, we have to first start with a more journalistic statement of what phenomenon is it that she's picking out that other people are also picking out. They have different definitions of, and then what is her definition supposed to explain or find the essential behind that. And so there's a romantic movement, really romantic movements in all the arts, right, in the 19th century, and in particular in literature. For Rand, she focuses on Hugo and Rostand and Dostoevsky, and in America, Hawthorne as romantic authors. I think all of those are people that other literary scholars would count as romantic authors. The paradigms I've encountered in literature classes and things are Shelley, Percy Shelley primarily, but Mary Shelley also, Byron, also in German literature, Rand thought of, well, there's Goethe, but also Schiller, thank you. That's what I was looking for. So these are the kinds of literary figures she has in mind, and they are people who are sort of unconventional. There's a big focus on emotions and big emotions in it, distinctive personalities rather than kind of stock types. And Rand thought of the recognition of free will as the kind of fundamental behind this. And this is
right, and
she
so
saw herself as a part of.
Though specifically, she saw herself more as a part of what she called romantic realist fiction, which is part of what is curious to me, given the strong element of fantasy in Atlas. And you could probably argue that, look, there's romantic realism and there's romantic fantasy, and there are two subgenres of the same wider genre. Though it's still interesting that she would make such a big deal about romantic realism, and yet her most famous work had such a fantasy element in it that it's questionable whether it counts as romantic realism.
And the work that she thought was most fully her, because she said The Fountainhead feels a little too realistic to me afterwards. And I have to say it does to me too. I like The Fountainhead a lot less than I like Atlas Shrugged. I mean, I like The Fountainhead a lot, but it's not, they're in totally different leagues in my view, which is why I wanted to do an Atlas project. And as much as I love The Fountainhead, and I'm pleased to be talking about it over the summer, I wasn't keen to spend as much time on it. So when she talked about romantic realism, right, she didn't think about there being a school of the romantic realists to whom which she subscribed. She she just described her own approach to literature that way. And I think what she meant by realism there is it was a feature of, like Ivanhoe. Romantic writing is often set in distant places and times that are remote from the world in which the author lives. And I think what she was stressing is that she didn't want to do that. She wanted to set her novels in what was some version of her own society. So although it might have fantastic elements in it, and indeed did, and she preferred the ones that did, it was still realist in the sense of being some version of, and so being directly applicable to, the society in which she was living, as opposed, again, to being like set in an enchanted forest or in some version of the Middle Ages that was very different from the actual Middle Ages, or some distant time and place. And you can see that in her talk later on about why she didn't want to continue writing fiction after Atlas. There were a few reasons. I think the biggest one was she had done what she set out to do. But another reason is she was more and more disgusted with the society she was in, and she didn't want to project novels in that society. And I think, it would have been, if she had projected them, some kind of somewhat different idealized version of it, but it would have still been the society of her time in a way, right? So a kind of altered take on that society, which is what Atlas is. And I think that it be that, some kind of take on or version of her society, her world that she was living in, was important to her. And important to her.
So by this standard, it sounds like you would say, that Anthem is not romantic realist at all. Am I right?
Anthem would be the furthest removed from that. But, she considered Anthem kind of a special case. She even called it a poem.
Right.
Which is interesting. So Anthem, I think, is the purest fantasy one. And it's an outlier among her novels in a number of respects.
Definitely. Do you mind if I mention one last thing that I learned myself this time around? So I mentioned before the role of self-esteem in explaining the behavior of the characters as one of the big examples of points that I saw from Galt's speech that was well illustrated in the novel on this latest reading. But another that falls under that same heading of points from Galt's speech that I see really well illustrated is the role of different metaphysical attitudes in the characters. And there's an essay a nonfiction essay that she did later on in the was it in the 60s or the 70s? I can't remember. The metaphysical versus the man-made. It appears in her collection, Philosophy Who Needs It. And I was rereading that essay very recently and noticing just how much of the psychology of what she's describing in that essay appears illustrated in various characters in Atlas Shrugged. And it's interesting because this is actually the topic of Alcoholics Anonymous came up last week when we did the Capstone broadcast. I can't remember why it came up, but it was connected with her discussion of religion, right? And the reason that she right, and so the essay begins by discussing this Serenity Prayer that Reinhold Niebuhr, who is a theologian, formulated, which is used by members of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, God grant me the serenity to change the things I can, accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. And she sees this, however much it might have had an origin from a religious thinker, as a really good illustration of the proper metaphysical attitude, which she regards as the primacy of existence. So we discussed, when we discussed Galt's speech, what she regarded as these axioms of metaphysics and therefore of philosophy, that existence exists, that consciousness is conscious, and that existence exists independently of consciousness. And that's what she calls the primacy of existence. And in the metaphysical versus the man-made, she talks about the rival perspective, which she calls the primacy of consciousness, which is also what she describes as the metaphysics that's behind the morality of death. And it's, of course, the idea that existence depends on consciousness, that it's somehow the product of consciousness in one form or another. And that ranges from the kind of personal subjectivist view, where you think that your own consciousness somehow creates reality, that wishing makes it so, to the sort of religious attitude where you think that something like God's consciousness is what creates the universe. And I found it really interesting, this reading of the essay. She talks about how people who adopt the primacy of consciousness viewpoint, because of the fact that they are failing to recognize the difference between existence and consciousness, have this strange kind of oscillation that they sometimes take in recognizing the power of consciousness. They see it either sometimes as having no power and sometimes being completely omnipotent, which is, of course, what you would do if you failed to recognize the difference between consciousness and existence and thought that consciousness wasn't dependent on existence for its own power, which is summarized in her invocation of Bacon, now that nature to be commanded must be obeyed. If you think that you can just command nature willy-nilly, you'll sometimes think yourself omnipotent. And then when you run up against nature and find that this doesn't work, you'll think yourself completely impotent. And this is, of course, something that applies to alcoholics, I would assume, which is why this is a role, plays a role in Alcoholics Anonymous. Somebody who's on the premise of going out and binging is basically thinking of themselves as omnipotent. They can get away with anything, but then the next morning, when they're suffering from the hangover, they sometimes try to escape responsibility and say, wasn't my fault, the drink made me do it, or I'm alcoholic in my genes or something like that. And you see the exact same kind of oscillation happening with Jim Taggart and various villains in Atlas all the time, who are on the primacy of consciousness premise. Like Greg, you put a lot of emphasis on the scene between Jim and Dagny, where Jim is saying, I want to be the president of a railroad, and why do you get to have all the fun? Dagny, why won't you make it possible for me to be the president of a railroad? So he's both got this attitude of omnipotence toward his own consciousness, but also towards Dagny's. And then, of course, you see elsewhere in the novel various villainous characters who have this kind of supernatural view of consciousness, and whenever they come up against someone who's a rational being, or at least has intelligence, they see it as a kind of mystical power that they need to either try to destroy because it invalidates their own consciousness, or try to rule because they think that they can absorb the magical power of their victim by doing so. And so there was just a lot of this that I saw this time around. And you see that then contrasted with the heroes who have this ultimate respect for existence and therefore, causality. And this time around, I saw so much more emphasis on that, especially in part 3, chapter 2, where everything's described in terms of costs, the costs and the price that you have to pay. And that this is Dagny's going to be the greediest of them because she's willing to pay the biggest cost. And then that gets recapitulated right toward the end in the last chapter, a survey of all the prices that they've paid to get to where they are. And so ultimate respect for causality and the nature to be commanded must be obeyed premise in defiance of the people like Jim who think consciousness is all supreme. And I saw so much of that this time around. I think both of these topics, self-esteem and metaphysics, I mean, you could write whole lengthy articles just on each of these topics and how they feature throughout the book. And if Robert ever wants to do another revised edition of his, maybe I would want to write one of those.
Well, Robert, if you're here, you could chime in on that. I recall him saying in the past that he didn't want to do revised editions of these, but he was open to someone else taking the helm for a revised thing, maybe someday, conceivably in the future. So maybe, Ben, you could approach Robert about that if you ever want to do something like that. Robert, sorry if I'm speaking on your behalf here. Anyway, yeah, I think something at some point you were saying that I had a thought on, but one thing about the Serenity Prayer, now that we're talking about it, is that it's a significant part of what's interesting about that is that you need the wisdom to know the difference between what you can control and what you can't, between what's within human volition and what isn't. And it's not obvious which things are all the time. And one of the really difficult, I think that's one of the reasons why Alcoholics Anonymous focuses on it. It's not if you have a problem with addiction or a mental illness in particular or some other serious problem, it's not clear just what things you can accomplish by an act of will and which you can't. You can't, for example, make yourself not crave a drink when you do, or if you're getting over a breakup, not with
Yeah.
someone who's bad, was bad for you, not miss her when whatever it is. There are things you can't control, and it's other things you can, and it takes a kind of insight to discover which are which, and then to use the ones you can control to steer the better course through life. So,
I mean, it's actually
I
true
think
that
all
if you
three parts of that
withdraw from alcohol, if you're a serious alcoholic and you just withdraw cold turkey, you will die. It's true. I've had plenty of doctors tell me horror stories about this, and so that's why there's special treatment that you need.
Why are plenty of doctors giving you this scare story, Ben?
Not for the reason that you think.
Okay, because I've always thought you to be a pretty moderate character. Plenty of doctors. So the doctors are running up to you all the time.
I know doctors who treat patients in New Orleans, so that's the main reason.
Well, that's a reason why. That is a reason. Okay, so there were a few other topics we wanted to cover. I think we've covered Atlas's fantasies. Will is talking about online cases in which he's faced this issue of not knowing what he could change and what he couldn't. And there are a lot of, this is, I think, a big issue in psychology. And Jason Rines, I think, talks only a little bit about this, but he and I had more discussions about it while he was writing it in his essay in The Companion on Metaphysics. And it was a period when he and I were talking a lot about this, as I recall, of, it's very difficult sometimes to know what's within your control and what isn't. Paul online says the wisdom to not go full cold turkey. But I mean, it's, psychology is a difficult field. And if you have any kind of mental illness or depression or addiction, it's not obvious what the right fix is. And that's one of the things that's tragic about these things. And, hopefully people can figure out what works. But I mean, there's a lot of, debates over what methods of treating addiction work well. And likewise for other psychological problems. Ben, I wanted to talk about a little bit about, we had a discussion about values and anti-values. People who are motivated by love and motivated by fear and hatred. Is it really the case that there are people who are motivated as Jim Taggart is? What about the idea that's associated with certain approaches to communication, like nonviolent communication, that you can find some positive values in everybody, and you should appeal to those? And this was brought up in the Capstone event, I think maybe by Harry or Henry, one of them. And I commented a bit on this, saying that, well, if someone's worth communicating with at all, and are open to be, it's possible to persuade them of something good, it's only going to be because of positive values they hold. So you should be looking for them and appealing to them. But I was also making the point that against a kind of Pollyanna-ish positive view where you assume everybody's got some good in them and you only speak to the good, I think it's very effective as a rhetorical device and communicative device, and it's an issue of justice to identify a positive pro-life value motivation and also a contrary immoral Jim Taggart-like motivation in cases where you think both might be operative in your audience. In part or all of your audience, or even in a given person, both might be there struggling. And to say, look, there are these two things, and which one are you going to go with? And I named a few cases where I thought that was done well, I think, or said it in principle, I think it could be done well. I wanted to mention one or two cases that I think are good models for that kind of communication. Alex Epstein's book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, I think does a good job of this. It talks in the beginning about the moral standard he's on in evaluating fossil fuels, and talks about not everybody's on this moral standard. Not every judgment people make is on the standard of what will promote human life and human flourishing, as Alex puts it in the book. But that's the standard I'm on. So then when he goes on to give arguments, and you can read through it and evaluate how good the arguments are about fossil fuels and alternative energy sources and so forth. But the point I'm making now is not about the case about oil in particular or fossil fuels in particular, but about the moral structure of the reasoning, right? He says, this is the standard I'm on. And now you read my arguments on these standards. And if you go by this standard, he thinks you'll reach his same conclusion. And then what he does throughout is points to ways in which arguments that, not always obvious ways, in which arguments for the contrary positions are not using the same standard, but are using the contrary standard. And then in the end, there's a chapter on the green movement that he thinks is dominated by that standard, and I think rightly thinks. I think that's true. So I think that's a model of using that kind of communication. I think you can see it in some of Don Watkins and Yaron Brooks work together. I think you could see it in Atlas Shrugged, in Galt's speech is on that model. And I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, and an addendum to the point that you should be looking for the positive values in your audience, to also be recognizing possible alternative forms of motivation and sensitizing readers to the difference between them, which will help them to see that in themselves and in others. And again, I just wanted to give Alex's book as a model for doing that well. And again, there are some other models as well. So that's one point. Any further points on this topic? Yeah,
that
Ben.
Is a model that we are trying very hard to implement in our approach to writing articles at New Ideal. We're very much on the premise of, rather than condemning our culture and its irrationality, looking to comment on issues where we see a group of people out there who are not already in agreement with Ayn Rand's philosophy, but with whom we have common values, and whom we think we can reach by showing that we've got something in common, and that we want to tell them more about our basis for it. And of course, the basis is the philosophy of objectivism.
Yeah, but I think there were sort of two sides to that, and it's important to keep the two sides live. So one side of it, and I think you guys probably are doing this, one side is the finding something in the audience that you could appeal to as a value they hold, and the other is keeping an explicit contrast to that, another type of motivation, rather than presenting it as though here we are all in the world, people with the same ultimate goals. And let me show you how my view is going to help you get to that ultimate goal better than other people. But there's a difference. There's two different standards you might have here. This is mine. I think I can see signs in you that you hold this standard too. I can see signs in you that you hold this standard too. Maybe not all the time, maybe not consistency. But isn't this a standard that you think is right and want to be on? Well, in that case, this is what follows. Let me show you how this is what follows. And let me also show you how in the arguments other people are giving you for the other side or for another position, they're not on this standard. And it relies on your accepting another standard or deviating from this standard, or relies on some kind of package deal between this and an opposite standard. I could see Ashley online has gotten very excited by this bit of the discussion. So she seems to be on board with this methodology. Good. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say on that topic. A few other topics. Ben, you wanted to talk about maybe actually this is in this connection actually, the morality of life and selfishness, and these two ways of framing.
And so, especially given the study that I undertook of Galt's speech, I was struck this time around by the difference in emphasis that you see in Galt's moral philosophy compared to, say, what you see in Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness and in the Objectivist Ethics. there's very little discussion of the virtue of selfishness, so to speak, in Galt's speech. Now, I mean, I think everything that he says about the morality of life is consistent with regarding rational selfishness as a virtue in the way that that Rand describes in that nonfiction work. But it's interesting to me the difference in emphasis, and it's interesting that she makes the choice later on, after Galt's speech, to bring up the issue of selfishness versus altruism, or selfishness versus self-sacrifice, much more explicitly than, by looking at the alternative of the morality of life versus the morality of death. I mean, I think that the morality of life versus the morality of death is really what gets to the fundamental issue that's actually at work in the alternative of self-interest versus self-sacrifice. But I sometimes wonder if people who had read just Galt's speech would have picked up on the fact that was the issue, because it is discussed so little. I mean, various points throughout the novel, you get the idea that people call the heroes selfish, and that the heroes think that there's something off about this as a criticism. And even Reardon will even say, yeah, I did it for my self-interest, make the most of it, in his courtroom speech. But you never get the issue kind of named explicitly as much as it is in the virtue of selfishness, which incidentally reminds me that it's kind of a similar issue with capitalism. I did a keyword search on the word capitalism, and it's mentioned all of once in all of Galt's speech, or all of Atlas Shrugged. And it's where, interestingly, Francisco reports that people call him a greedy capitalist. So those two issues go together. But again, it has to wait for Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, the nonfiction work, for the kind of implications for this political issue to get spelled out. Did you have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, so you talked about the contrast between Galt's speech and the virtue of selfishness, and the Objectivist ethics, which is the first essay in the virtue of selfishness. I haven't reread it with this in mind, but my sense is that it's I'm just searching on self in that essay right now as I look through it, and I don't think is there that much more on. I think the title, "The Virtue of Selfishness," and the lead and the introduction to the virtue of selfishness really puts selfishness in central view, and starts a fight for this word selfishness, and focuses it on.
You're right that even the Objectivist ethics doesn't discuss it so much.
But the Objectivist ethics, I think, that article is more in style here with Galt's speech. And of course, Galt's speech does discuss the ethics of altruism and the ethics of self-sacrifice, and puts what Galt is presenting as in stark contrast to that, as an opposite to it. So in that sense, it is about the alternative between self-interest and self-sacrifice, but it's not framing it in terms of selfishness, or at least not putting that concept in the advertising in the same way. And I think that's a literary choice, and a choice of I mean literary, not just that Atlas is literature and the virtue of selfishness is. I mean it's a kind of point of style and context in both places. So in Atlas, it's doesn't fit with the literary purpose. In the in the Objectivist ethics, putting the word selfish front and center, and making that bold, making the kind of bold challenge to conventional morality in those terms at the outset, is not the fitting with the fundamental purpose of that essay, but for the book it is. And I think what's important is that this code of ethics, which Galt calls the morality of life, Rand calls the Objectivist ethics, or the virtue of selfishness, or the morality of rational self-interest, is, on several different counts, a real challenge to conventional moral thinking, a departure from it, something different, something that requires you to break with the way you've been taught, and to embrace something new if you accept it. And there are different aspects of what's new and significantly different about it. That it's a morality of reason, right? That it's a morality that's against sacrifice. That it's a morality for life on Earth, and which of these you're focusing on is going to change how you would frame it in each which presentation, and what you're taking your foils to be, and in what forms they're most salient to people. So I see this as a kind of literary or stylistic choice that has to do with occasions. What thing to stress on what occasion and what thing she stressed on what occasion. But I think what's not an issue of style in that way is that you can't, you're not accurately presenting the view if you do things that try to brunt the radicalness of it. And I think people will want to sometimes shy away from selfishness for that reason. And Galt, I mean, Galt doesn't need to stress the radicalness of it in that way. He's just destroyed the world so that he's a radical, and he's telling his listeners that they don't want to live and that he's destroyed the world because their ideas are evil. I mean, he doesn't need a title like The Virtue of Selfishness in that context to underscore the point. Harry's asking us something about this. Are there ways you found to reach colleagues who wouldn't even consider Ayn Rand at first? Well, that's pretty far removed from discussing Atlas Shrugged. One thing I'll say that I think is sometimes helpful is owning these kinds of facts, owning that this is meant to be a radical philosophy, and pointing out that there are other philosophical views, some of which they respect, that are similarly radical. Right, so they might agree with some or disagree with some, but you shouldn't take it as an attempt to just systematize our automatic view, our pre-existing views, and then drawing other parallels to things that they understand and respect can often help. Aristotle and other things. Paul's asking why don't people academics have a better view of objectivism? Why do they weasel their way out of it, etc.? Well, Paul, if you want my views on that, I refer you to the introductory essay in A Companion to Ayn Rand, which is called An Introduction to the Study of Ayn Rand, that is available for free as a sample of the book online. I say some about that there, and also you can see some of Ben and my interacting with some people who behave in the way you describe in the Ayn Rand Society's blog or old blog. There's some back and forth where Ben and I both write about scholars who are behaving in this way. Is that all you want to say about that, Ben, or you're making an exasperated noise?
Yeah, I think I don't have anything to add. I have things I could say, but I don't want to say them, so I won't.
All right. Kirk asks, any objectivist intellectuals doing work in the vein of Peikoff's Dim book, and he's trying to understand Jordan Peterson, who he's fascinated by. I don't know anybody other than Dr. Peikoff and Dr. Peikoff's not doing much. He's retired now, but who's following up specifically on the dim categories. I know, several objectivists have thoughts about Peterson. I think of him as essentially a mystic. If I had to, but I'm not an expert on Peterson, but if I had to classify him off the cuff in Dr. Peikoff's terms, I would probably put him as an M1. But again, use your own judgment on that stuff.
And that's what Kirk is suggesting here. Kirk suggests he might be a worldly supernaturalist, which I think is what
or a knowing skeptic. So an M1 or a D1. I would think of him more as on the M1 side. Often you'll find people who are mixes of these things, and so you might think of him that way. Okay. There were two questions from people on the forum earlier that we should answer about particular themes or issues in the novel. Pooja wanted to ask why Dagny responds to Reardon as she does in their morning after scene. That Reardon kind of tells her off, and you're, so a viler creature, and we're both, I have contempt for you, and this lowest desire, and all this stuff. And Dagny sort of answers him in his own terms, saying, I don't want your spirit or whatever, so long as you'll come to me for that lowest one of your desires. And Pooja asks, why does she put it that way? When she, Dagny, doesn't think it's that lowest one of his desires. And as Reardon later acknowledges, Dagny understands that he's giving her his spirit and all the things she said she didn't want by means of that desire. Why does Dagny put it then the way she does? My thought is that's the way that he can understand the point then. And Dagny's not, what's she going to do? Give him a lecture on, desire and the nature of sex and so forth? That wouldn't be sexy. And he wouldn't understand that anyway. So she just says she's happy with that, and she puts it, in the kind of terms he could understand. It's not strictly accurate, but then it's an act of kind of defiance and embrace of what he wants from her. It's not meant to be a pedagogical moment. Ben, any further thoughts on that?
Well, this is also kind of characteristic of Dagny, a kind of sarcastic approach to what she regards as error, which is part of her way of not taking it seriously. You see the same thing, don't you, when she's speaking with James, and he says, you're not human, you've never felt anything. And she says, no, James, I've never felt anything at all. Which she knows is not literally true either. Now, of course, James is very different from Reardon, but they're both making some kind of mistake here, and this is her kind of way of dismissing it.
Yeah, but I think it's different. So there's no defiance in her saying that with James. And I think she shouldn't have said that to James. She should have just walked out on James and not had anything to do with him. I don't think that's what she should have done with if Dagny knew everything, well, I guess everything would mean that there's this other guy, John Galt, and she likes him more. But if she knew everything philosophically at the beginning of the novel, I don't think she would respond to Reardon by not wanting to have anything to do with him, and she would have with Jim. I think she would have responded to Reardon similarly to as she does. So, and there's a kind of defiance there, and the kind of I don't know. That's all I have to say really about that. Harry seems like he's agreeing with that. Now, Alex had asked when precisely does Stadler go bad? That is, when does he become? That was my kind of simplification of the question. Ben, can you see the full question that she asked? Because I might be oversimplifying it.
Today I was reading Altruism as Appeasement and was struck by how perfectly it described the moral development of Robert Stadler. He started out as an intelligent and ambitious man and later sold his soul to appease the anti-intellectual thugs. At what point did he go from victim to perpetrator of the destruction of man's mind? Was it with the founding of the State Science Institute, or was it earlier than that when he first concluded that reason holds no power over the mind of the average man?
So I'd have to reread Altruism as Appeasement to opine on how well it describes Stadler. I haven't thought of it in this connection before. My sense is that what's going on there is, Stadler is somebody who is actively advocating for force, and I forget whether what role that plays in Altruism as Appeasement in that article, whether that's discussed. That's not what stands out to me in my recollection of it. But when does he go to, Ben, how did she put it? When did he transition from what to what?
It was from victim to perpetrator of the destruction of man's mind. It's never clear that he was ever a victim.
Well, he's someone who...
Except insofar as everybody like him was.
He's someone who is very lonely, being intelligent in a world where intelligence isn't recognized. He's someone who, as a young person, would have faced all the kinds of problems that Francisco must have faced, and that the professor would, remember that professor character who was sad for Francisco because he has too great thought that he would be really disappointed in the world and so forth. I think there are going to be a lot of situations in which Stadler was a victim early on. But the founding of the State Science Institute was when he undertook to when he undertook to use force to achieve his aims and to sacrifice other people. And I think that is a really significant development in his character. And it's the one that Galt damns him for, and that Axton, in a way, damns him for. Now, he was already doing a fair amount bad to get to that point. And we can already see his kind of unphilosophical character and his disregard of ideology and so forth earlier than that in the things that are narrated. And then, of course, later than that, I think he still has the opportunity to come back. I think he could have chosen to not sacrifice Rearden Metal, or not try to sacrifice Rearden Metal on the altar of the State Science Institute. And then later than that, he could have chosen to not endorse that book. And then later than that, he could have chosen to not go on the radio and say what he said after Project X. So there are a lot of choice points here. And I don't think there's one point at which somebody goes from being good to evil, like flipping a switch. I think he had these competing strands within him, and at many points he made the wrong choice, a choice that feeds and grows the worst part of his motivation, because it's on the worst part of his motivation, and betrays the good in him. And insofar as there's still any good in him, that good in him is the victim of his bad. So there's, again, not a point when he goes all the way from being man the hero and victim or man the victim to man the killer, but he's going further and further in that direction at every point, and at every point until the final end, his good is being victimized by his bad. But I think the key point is founding of the State Science Institute. That's when he crosses the line into the use of force. That's when Galt stops wanting to have anything to do with him. And I think that's, if you want to pick a point at which he's essentially on the side of the wrong, it's from then on.
Greg, I think that we should start to wrap up. The other things that we had on our list, I think we wouldn't finish in under 2 hours, and we should try to stay under 2.
Where are we now? We started about 10 minutes late. Let's see. Okay, Alex is thanking us for that. Are there other people who want to, or asking things live? Is anyone who's here online live have anything they want to say about this? One thing
I think that
I want to mention. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
There are two related thoughts I want to mention. One is about the way in which we're relying on what it looks like to be reliant on great producers, and what things people often don't notice about that fact. So that point, and then another is about what it's like to break with the culture in the way Rand said one should. And I think those are, good closing points. So the first one, a way into is to just mention this issue of the tech companies and so forth. And this is a way to frame, I guess, both of these points. But I don't want to focus only on the tech companies. It's a broader point that you can use them as an example to make. Notice how in Atlas, the negative characters assume the goods created by the heroes as something that's just there and their due, and is a kind of a static quantity, as though it were a natural resource. It was always there. It ought to always be there. It didn't come about through someone's work. It's not now being sustained through someone's work, and it's not a kind of thing that should always be getting better and can always be getting better and different through people's work. And I think if you look a lot at the discussions of the internet now, you really see this premise that the way the internet works, or Facebook works, or YouTube works, the sharing of videos works, is just the way it is, as though the internet was always there, and that's how it always worked, and that's how it should work, and we're all entitled to have it work that way, and to whatever benefits to us come about from its working that way. But that's not true, right? None of these things existed 50 years ago. Many of them didn't exist 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, and they've all been changing all that time. And that's the pattern with technological advance. It's the pattern when the men of the mind are producing things and creating things. And you can't expect or want them to stay put, and you can't take them as your due when somebody else is creating them. I mean, it's as though, the way we find things on internet has to do with Google's coming up with page rank and so forth, and that has to do with them deciding what ways, what criteria are best for finding the kind of information people want to find. And it's inherent in having an internet that works that way, that people are going to come up with different ways and try to change how you can find information and what ways to recommend information to readers. That's inherent in the process. There's not some way it was, that it's sort of the default way it should be and everybody's owed it. And when you look at discussions of the internet or any other field of technology, the transportation system, the highway system, the privacy, smartphones, anything else, you have to be aware of medicine. This is a huge thing in discussions of medical technology and the pharmaceutical companies. Really be aware of the assumption that the goods are here, that there's a certain kind of state of technology or way things are that's just how it is by nature, that's not due to somebody's virtue and work, and that is owed to us to stay the same, the way Jim Taggart wanted it to stay the same. And I think if you look at the kinds of attacks we're getting on the tech companies now across the political spectrum, there's a lot of that premise behind them. But I think you find it in just a lot of places. If you look at discussions of the medical industry elsewhere. So in particular, what I have in mind with the medical industry, people who are upset that new drugs are expensive, as though they should all be available to everybody because God rained them down on us or something, and not that someone invented them and someone invested money to get it invented and so forth. So that's one issue. The other issue here that I wanted to talk about, and this one I think, Ben, will be the good one for us to close on, is what it means to break with the culture. Because I think a lot of people have the idea that everything bad in our culture politically is coming from some one segment. I think a lot of people who are in the audience that tends to get attracted to Atlas Shrugged just because of where it gets recommended and so forth and who are the obvious villains, tend to think the villains in the culture are the left or the communists or the people who are sort of communist light or something, or the people who are more connected to the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. And if you go to other corners of the culture, most of them less likely to start reading Atlas Shrugged, they'll think it's coming from the Republicans or from religion or from racists or from some other little niche. And those are the bad guys. And the good guys are whatever large coalition is aligned against them. Whether it's the right because the right is against the left, or whether it's the, quote, resistance because the resistance is against Trump, or whether it's Antifa because Antifa is against the fascists, or whether it's the alt-right because the alt-right is against Antifa, or whoever the hell it is. You have this idea of a culture that's basically good, and there's some movement or cabal or group or some particular threat that we all have to line up against that faction. But if you think that way, whether you think that way and you think of yourself as on the right or on the left or in some other, niche, or as a libertarian, I think you are what Galt would think of, in the best case scenario, as a scab. Someone who hasn't broken with the culture, who hasn't realized what's wrong with it. What Rand's suggesting in Atlas, and what I think is true, is that there are ideas that are absolutely pervasive in our culture, everywhere in it, in every group and cabal, in every group and movement, with perhaps some rare, tiny exceptions, and dominating and shaping the way all of these groups and movements think. On the right, not one bit less than on the left. In the libertarians, just as much. On the left, as much as the right. Everywhere. There's this idea of altruism. There's this idea of collectivism. There's a disrespect of the mind and a failure to recognize its reality and its role in life. And it's there everywhere. It's mixed in a lot of these places with other better influences. A kind of Enlightenment heritage, the influence of Aristotle, the influence of Newton. But even in the better groups, you find it distorted by the presence of that they're part of this culture. They're part of a culture that, as Galt thinks of it, has accepted the morality of death, and that doesn't recognize the mind. And if that's right, then to achieve your full stature as a human being in your own life, to preserve your self-respect and to gain it and to earn it, and to affect positive cultural change on whatever scale you can, you really have to break from all of these movements. It doesn't mean have nothing to do with any of them ever in any respect, but to see yourself as not a part of the left, the right, the libertarians, or any other of these large-scale cultural movements, if indeed Rand's right that they're all on this premise. And that's something that takes a lot of time and work to see. And it's difficult to think about how to come together with other people who have had this realization. Perhaps, I'm almost certainly inspired to have it by Rand, to have a positive movement for that. And you're going to have a lot of false starts in your attempts at that, and a lot of times when people will backslide into the culture. And that's just par for the course, I think, of being really radical in the way that objectivism is really radical. Any thoughts on that, Ben?
I think we should wrap up. And I think that we should mention
All right.
What we're going to be doing next. We mentioned before that there will not be a Fountainhead project, but I don't think that you should take that to mean that you and I, Greg, will not be doing anything together with a similar format in the future. In fact, I mean, we want to, and there are proposals in the air for what form that might take, and it's not very definite yet, and we're in very early stages of thinking about it. But I hope that we will be back in one form or another, not necessarily to discuss a major book, but maybe to discuss shorter pieces or smaller issues, and certainly always from a philosophic perspective.
I think what we'd like to do is continue this type of format of discussion. I don't think we're going to, in the near future, do another long format thing like the Atlas Project, which meets over months and months and months, but maybe do one-off broadcasts on particular pieces or issues, or short sequences of a few weeks in a row on related topics, and maybe we'll build up again to something big like this. But we want to do it in more bite sizes for the time being. And I want to definitely keep in touch with the group in New York and have you guys involved in some things we do, and whether that's future broadcasts like this or just getting together to discuss something that's not on the air. let's definitely do that. I'm hoping to do more of that over the summer. And we're already in talks with ARI and with some of you guys individually about what to do. So we're looking forward to more of that. And again, come to Ocon. You'll hear us both talk about 2 novels there, and a lot of
Ashley
other
is calling us the dynamic duo.
Are we that dynamic?
So which one is Batman and which one is Robin, Ashley? You don't have to answer that.
I don't know that we want to have map us onto superhero characters. We'll end up in the extended universe with all these extras. That's what I don't like about comic books. They all end up on these ridiculous tab teams of 30 comic book heroes fighting each other or something. All right. Anyway, thanks, Ashley. Thanks, everyone else. Thank you all for being a part of this, and we will see you again online. I'm not sure in what format. We also then have to think about what we're going to do with the Facebook group for the Atlas Project. It's going to stay in existence as a place for people to go and look at all the back posts and so forth. We don't want to open it up to have it as a general discussion group because it'll end up spamming everybody. But maybe we could have occasional posts on it or discussions, or we'll have to think about how to do that. But we have a lot of people there with some shared interests and contexts.
In question, we will see what we do with it.
I'm going to think about it. Anyway, thank you all. Good night and good premises.